There is a building on Southwest Morrison Street in Portland, Oregon, that I have been watching for 27 years. I built it in 1997, poured the foundation in February, which anyone who knows Portland weather will tell you is a commitment bordering on lunacy. The ground was cold, and the sky was the color of old concrete, and my site foreman, a man named Dale who had been with me since 1989, told me we were insane to break ground in February. I told him that the right time to build something permanent is precisely when it is uncomfortable to do so. He shook his head. He was right about the weather. I was right about the building. That building is 14 stories tall. It has a lobby with marble floors, Portuguese limestone, not the cheap domestic substitute, because I made that decision in 1996, and I made it correctly. It has a rooftop mechanical unit I approved the service contract for in 2019. It has a ground floor atrium that can be rented for private events, and it has 4 floors, 11 through 14, occupied by a mid-sized technology consulting firm called Meridian Consulting, whose lease with my holding company is worth approximately $3 million over 6 years, and was renewed 8 months ago with what I am told was considerable ceremony. I was not at the signing. I am never at the signings. That is the architecture of the arrangement. My name is Edward. I am 71 years old. I spent 41 years acquiring, developing, and managing commercial properties across the Pacific Northwest. Office buildings, industrial complexes, retail strips, a small portfolio of warehouse units that I began assembling in 1983 when I bought my first one at a county auction with the proceeds of a second mortgage and a level of confidence that, looking back, can only be described as spectacular ignorance. I did not know what I was doing in 1983, but I knew how to read a deed, and I knew how to read a room, and in commercial real estate, those are the 2 skills that determine everything else. I now own 23 commercial properties across 4 states. They are managed quietly through a family holding company, registered under my late wife's maiden name, Harlow. The company is called Harlow Property Group. Margaret chose the name herself in 1991, sitting at our kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside her while she wrote options on a yellow legal pad. She said, "If we put your name on it, every contractor in Portland will know what they're negotiating against." She was right. She was almost always right. I put her name on it instead, and for 33 years, nobody has looked at the building on Southwest Morrison Street and connected it to me. My son-in-law has paid me rent for 6 years. He has no idea. I sit on a bench across from that building on the first Monday of every month. I do this not for sentimental reasons. I am not a sentimental man by temperament, though I have become more careful with sentiment as I have gotten older, the way you become more careful with anything that has proven itself genuinely valuable. I sit on that bench because a property developer who stops looking at his buildings stops understanding them. I have watched that building in every season. I know which facade panels catch the afternoon light in a way that makes the building look taller than it is. I know which ground floor windows collect condensation in December. I know that the northeast corner of the lobby gets a draft in January that I approved a correction for in 2014, an improvement, not a resolution. I know this building the way a man knows something he has cared for over a long time. Not with sentiment, with attention. The coffee cart on the corner has been there for 19 years. The man who runs it is named Kevin, and he knows my order without being asked. Medium drip, no sugar. The cup wrapped in a second sleeve because my hands run cold in the mornings. Kevin has never asked me what I do, or why I sit on the bench across from the building. In 19 years, we have exchanged perhaps 400 words total. It is one of the better relationships of my professional life. On the first Monday of last October, I was sitting on that bench with my medium drip and my gray jacket when my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from my daughter, Claire. "Vincent wants to talk to you," she wrote. He's being weird about it. I looked at the text for a moment. Then I looked back at the building. The morning light was coming in at an angle that caught the glass on the 11th floor, Vincent's floor, though he did not know I knew that, and turned it briefly the color of copper. I watched until the angle shifted and the glass went back to gray. I typed back, "Tell him to call." Then I put my phone in my pocket and finished my coffee. A property developer learns early that the most valuable thing in any building is not the structure itself. It is the paper underneath it, the deed, the lease, the right to decide who stays and who goes. I spent 41 years holding that paper. When my son-in-law signed the lease renewal on the 4 floors of the Morrison Street building 8 months ago, when he sat in the conference room on the 11th floor with his broker and his office manager, and a bottle of celebratory champagne, he signed $3 million worth of paper directly into my hand. He just did not know it yet. He was about to call me and invite me to dinner. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened at that dinner, and what happened in the weeks after it, and what happened in the atrium of my own building on a Friday night when the people who tried to remove me from my daughter's life found out exactly who they had been living inside of. I am not a dramatic man. I do not make scenes. I do not raise my voice. I build things. I hold paper. I wait. They had been renting space inside my patients for 6 years without knowing the price. The invoice was about to arrive. But first, before I tell you what was in the envelope Gerald placed on that restaurant table, and what I placed on top of it when I stood up and walked out, and how a plain white business card became the most expensive piece of paper 3 people had ever touched in their lives, hit the like button right now. Leave a comment telling me where you are watching from. Because if you have ever been underestimated by someone who looked at your hands and your jacket and your silence and decided you were nothing, you already know how this story ends. I have been sitting on this bench for a long time. I am just getting started. Vincent called on a Tuesday evening, 4 days after Claire's text. He did not call often. In 6 years of marriage to my daughter, Vincent had called me perhaps a dozen times, and each of those calls had a transaction at its center. He called when he and Claire were buying their first house together, and he wanted to know whether I thought the offer price was reasonable. I told him the comparable sales suggested it was fair, and that he should negotiate the inspection contingency carefully. He thanked me, and then did not call again for 14 months. He called once when Claire was in the hospital with a kidney infection, and he wanted to know whether I was planning to visit. Not, I noticed, to invite me, but to establish my intentions so he could plan around them. He called once to tell me that Meridian had won a significant contract, and that he and Claire were going to celebrate in Napa that weekend, which I understood was not an update so much as a signal, a man announcing his own success. This call was different. I could hear it in the first 3 seconds. He had rehearsed. Not in the way an actor rehearses, nothing so theatrical. In the way a man rehearses when he has something to ask that he is not certain will be received well, and he has run the conversation in his head until the words feel familiar enough to say, without his voice betraying him. There was a precise, managed quality to his opening. His tone was careful, considered. He said, "Edward, how are you?" Not a question, a staging device. I told him I was fine. I was sitting in the kitchen with a glass of water, watching the light change over the backyard. I did not tell him that. He said that his parents were visiting from San Francisco the following weekend. Gerald and Margaret. He said they had been wanting to spend time with Claire's family for a while now, and here I noted the construction. Claire's family, not you, not Edward, as if he were describing a category rather than a person, and that it seemed like the right moment for everyone to get properly acquainted. He described it as a dinner. He named a restaurant in the Pearl District that I recognized, the kind of place where the menus have no prices, which is either a design choice or a warning, depending on your perspective. He said, "I hope you'll join us." I said, "I'll be there." There was a small pause. The pause of a man who was prepared for more resistance and is recalibrating. Then he said, "Great," and moved immediately to the logistical details. Saturday at 7. He would make the reservation. Valet parking was available. I told him I would find my own parking. Another small pause. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a while. I had 41 years of experience reading the room before walking into it. The call had told me several things that Vincent did not intend to communicate. The first was that this dinner was not his idea. The careful phrasing, the managed tone, the way he said his parents had been wanting, all of it pointed to a man delivering a message rather than issuing an invitation. The second was that the dinner had a purpose beyond the stated one. Men who simply want to have a pleasant family meal do not rehearse the phone call. The third was that the purpose involved me specifically. He had not described it as a family dinner. He had described it as an opportunity for everyone to get properly acquainted, which is a phrase you use when you have an agenda for the acquaintance. In 41 years of commercial real estate, I never once signed a document without reading every clause. I accepted Vincent's invitation, and I began reading. I should tell you about Vincent. Not the version he would tell you, the polished, deliberate version he has been constructing and presenting for years. The one where he is a first-generation technology entrepreneur who built Meridian Consulting from 3 employees and a vision into a regional force, with a $40 million acquisition on the table. That version is technically accurate, in the same way that a building's facade is technically part of the structure. It is the part designed to be seen. What matters is the foundation. Vincent Ashford is 41 years old. He is tall and well-dressed, in the particular way of men who understand that appearance is a form of communication, and have chosen to communicate wealth and authority. He has good instincts about rooms, who to speak to first, which handshake to invest in, when to lean forward, and when to lean back. These are real skills. I do not make the mistake of dismissing real skills simply because I do not like the man who has them. He is good at selling. He is good at performing certainty. He has built a company that, from the outside, looks like exactly what he says it is. My daughter loves him. Loved him. I was beginning to understand, in the weeks before that dinner, that the tense was becoming complicated. Claire is 38 years old, and she is the most important person in my life. She has her mother's eyes, and her mother's way of going quiet when something is wrong. Not cold, but interior, like a room where someone has just lowered the lights. I had noticed the lights going down over the previous year. Not dramatically, incrementally, the way a building settles. She had said, in the text, "He's being weird about it." Claire does not use the word weird lightly. She is precise with language. She always has been. And weird was doing specific work in that sentence. It meant, something about this is not what it appears to be. It meant, I noticed something, and I am not sure what to do with it. It meant, I thought you should know. I had thought about that word for 4 days before Vincent called. The restaurant was in the Pearl District, on a street where the buildings were all renovated industrial. Exposed brick, steel casements, concrete floors sealed to a high shine. I know the architectural history of that neighborhood. I know which buildings were converted in the early 90s and which ones came later, when the money arrived and brought its preferences with it. I parked 4 blocks away and walked. I have done this my entire professional life. You learn more about a building approaching it on foot than you ever do pulling up to the valet. I arrived at 7, exactly. Gerald and Margaret were already seated. A man who arrives first to a table he has arranged controls the table. Gerald knew this. He was positioned with his back to the wall and a sight line to the door, the same instinct I have used in every significant meeting of my 41-year career. I registered it without reacting to it. The ability to register something without reacting to it is a skill that takes decades to develop. Gerald Ashford is 68 years old. He is a broad man, not fat, but occupying space with a physical confidence that suggests he has never once been the smallest person in a room and has built an identity around that fact. He was wearing a suit that fit with the precision of something made for him specifically, and a watch on his left wrist that I recognized as a reference-grade piece worth somewhere between $80,000 and $120,000. I know what watches cost because I spent a decade in the 90s doing due diligence on retail properties, including a jewelry corridor in a downtown Portland mall, and I priced inventory for 3 years as part of that process. Gerald wore his watch the way some men carry weapons, not to use them, but to be understood. Margaret Ashford is 65 and carries herself with the practiced ease of a woman who has spent decades in rooms where social hierarchy is enforced through aesthetics rather than argument. She was wearing silk, a deep ivory that absorbed the restaurant's warm lighting and gave it back as something more expensive. She looked at me when I arrived, the way a building inspector looks at a hairline crack in a foundation wall, with professional recognition and quiet, satisfied certainty about what it means. Claire was beside Vincent, in a burgundy dress, her hair up. She looked beautiful and slightly tense, the way a person looks when they have been performing warmth for an hour and are beginning to feel the effort of it. She brightened when she saw me, genuinely. That brightness, uncalculated, immediate, was the only unscripted thing at the table. Vincent rose to shake my hand. His grip was firm, and his eye contact was direct and calibrated, the grip of a man who has practiced it and confirmed that it works. He introduced me to his parents. Gerald nodded without standing. Margaret offered her hand across the table and smiled with the specific warmth of a person who has already decided what they think of you and is being gracious in the meantime. I sat down. I ordered water. I placed my napkin in my lap, and I looked around the table, and I began the work of the evening, which was to listen. The conversation for the first hour was what these conversations always are: managed performance. Gerald talked about San Francisco real estate, the market, the values, the particular insight it takes to navigate it, in the tone of a man who expects his opinions to be received as expertise. He mentioned investment properties, a family trust, positions in several technology companies. He mentioned these things the way you mention the weather, as established fact, as context, as the baseline against which everything else should be measured. Margaret asked Claire about her work. Claire manages community partnerships for a nonprofit, and listened to the answer with the polite attention of someone waiting for their turn to speak. Vincent played host. He ordered wine with the authority of a man making a statement about himself. I ate the lamb. I drank water. I watched. When you have spent 41 years in commercial real estate, you develop a specific tolerance for the preliminary portion of a negotiation, the part before the actual terms are introduced, where both parties are still pretending that the meeting is about something other than what it is actually about. You learn to be patient during this portion without appearing to be waiting. You learn to make the other party feel that you are engaged and present and slightly less formidable than you actually are. I have been doing that for 41 years. Gerald was good at the preliminary portion. He was smooth and assured, and he had the practiced ease of a man who wins these meetings often enough to have stopped noticing that they are meetings. But at a certain point, after the main course was cleared, after the server had offered the dessert menu and been declined, after the wine in Gerald's glass had reached its last quarter, Gerald reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He produced an envelope, white, thick, sealed, corporate-looking, the kind of envelope that communicates, before it is opened, that its contents have been prepared deliberately. He placed it on the table in front of me, directly in front of me, not to the side, not between us, with the practiced casualness of a man who has done this before, which I suspected he had. He said, "We have a proposal we'd like to discuss." The table went quiet. Claire looked at the envelope. Then she looked at Vincent. Vincent was looking at the table. I looked at Gerald. Gerald did not open the envelope himself. That was the first thing I noticed. He placed it on the table and left it there, sealed, the way you place a document you want the other party to open, so that the act of opening it belongs to them, so that the moment of discovery is theirs and not yours. It is a negotiation technique, a good one. I have used it myself. I did not touch the envelope. I looked at Gerald, and I waited. He understood that I was not going to open it. He picked it up, broke the seal with a practiced motion, the motion of a man who has opened many envelopes in many rooms, and slid out its contents. A single item, a cashier's check. He placed it face up on the table between us, and he left his 2 fingers resting at its edge, the way you present a document you want properly examined. The amount on the check was $35,000. I looked at the number. I looked at Gerald. I kept my face the way I keep it in every negotiation, open, attentive, giving nothing back. Gerald said, "Let me explain what this is." He explained it clearly and without apology, which I respected, even as I registered exactly what it was. The explanation was this. Vincent was in the final stages of positioning Meridian Consulting for a significant acquisition, a $40 million deal. The acquiring company's due diligence team was conducting a comprehensive review of Meridian's executive profile, the leadership team, their backgrounds, their family circumstances, their social adjacencies. It was standard practice at this level, Gerald said. Standard practice. He used the phrase twice. The issue, he continued, was one of optics. I was Edward Hargrove, a retired property manager, modest lifestyle, no visible professional standing, unclear history. In the context of a $40 million acquisition, a CEO whose father-in-law presented as a building superintendent, his word, not mine, though he delivered it with the casual authority of a man who believes his descriptions are simply accurate, created a credibility question for investors who were already conducting granular background checks on the entire executive family structure. Gerald said, "I am sure you understand that perception is a real factor at this level." He said it without cruelty. He said it as fact. Then he told me the condition attached to the $35,000. I was to relocate to a retirement community in Scottsdale, Arizona. There was a facility already identified. He named it. A luxury senior living campus. The kind of place with golf and wellness programs and enough organized social activity to explain why a man might reasonably disengage from his family for months at a stretch. I was to tell Claire it was for my health. I was to characterize it as my own decision, made for my own reasons. I was to gradually reduce contact, phone calls less frequent, visits discontinued. My presence in Claire and Vincent's life diminished to the point of irrelevance. The timeline he suggested was 4 months. By the time the acquisition closed, I should effectively no longer be a visible part of the picture. He said, "This isn't personal, Edward." He said it with the practiced kindness of a man who understands that telling someone something isn't personal is the most efficient way to prevent them from taking it personally, and who does not particularly care whether it works. I looked at the check. I looked at Gerald. Vincent was still looking at the table. He had not spoken since Gerald produced the envelope. He was holding the stem of his wine glass with 2 fingers, not drinking from it, the way a man holds something when he needs something to hold. Then Margaret spoke. She had been quiet through Gerald's presentation, not disengaged but conserving, watching me the way she had watched me since I sat down, with that clinical, settled certainty. She reached forward and touched the edge of the cashier's check lightly with one fingertip, as if orienting it, as if placing it correctly within the landscape of the table. Then she looked at my hands on the white tablecloth, my hands, which are weathered and calloused from 41 years of site visits, of cold mornings on construction lots, of concrete and steel, and the physical reality of what it means to build something. And she said, "Edward, men like you built the walls. Men like Vincent run what's inside them. That's just how the world works." She said it pleasantly. That was the extraordinary thing. She was not performing cruelty. She was not raising her voice or leaning forward or sharpening her tone. She delivered it the way you deliver an observation about the weather, as something obvious, something settled, something that requires no defense, because it has already been universally accepted by anyone reasonable. She looked at my hands, and she described the distance between my life and her son's, with the serene confidence of a woman who has never once been wrong about the distance between people. The table was quiet. I looked at Gerald. I looked at Margaret. I looked at Vincent, who was now looking at the wall behind my left shoulder with the focused attention of a man looking at nothing. I looked at Claire. She was very still. Her hands were in her lap, below the tablecloth, and she was looking at her father with an expression that I will not attempt to translate here, because some expressions are too complicated for translation, and because I needed, in that moment, to stay in the room I was actually in, rather than the room that expression was opening up inside of me. I took a breath. Then I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. I produced a business card, plain white, no logo. The text on it was minimal: a name, a phone number, an email address. The name on the card was not my name. The name on the card was the name of my holding company, Harlow Property Group. I placed the card on top of the cashier's check. I set it down flat, carefully, the way you place a document you want properly examined. I did not explain it. I looked at Gerald for a moment. Then I looked at Margaret. Then I stood up, the way a man stands up when a meeting is over. Not abruptly, not dramatically, simply with the unhurried certainty of someone who has decided that his business here is concluded. I folded my napkin and set it beside my plate. I looked at the lamb I had not quite finished. The lamb was rich, and I had eaten carefully, which had the secondary benefit of giving me something to look at during Gerald's presentation that was not Gerald. I pushed my chair back from the table. I leaned over and kissed Claire on the top of her head. She did not move. She was still very still. I could feel the tension in her, the way you feel tension in a structure, not by looking at it, but by placing your hand against it and knowing. I said, "I need some air." The lamb was richer than I expected. I said it to no one in particular. I said it pleasantly, the way you say something that is partially true and does not require a response. I walked out of the restaurant. The night air on the Pearl District sidewalk was cold and smelled like rain that had not arrived yet. I walked 4 blocks to my truck. I got in. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine off, and I looked through the windshield at the street in front of me, at the renovated industrial buildings with their brick and steel casements, at the lights in the restaurant windows, at the ordinary Thursday evening of a city that had no interest in what had just happened at a table inside one of its restaurants. I did not call Ruth yet. I sat for a long time. Then I drove home. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the dark backyard beyond the window and thought about a business card sitting on top of a cashier's check in the Pearl District. The card was still there. Gerald had it now, or he would shortly. He would look at it. He would register the company name, Harlow Property Group, and it would mean nothing to him. It would be the business card of a man who works with properties, a building superintendent, as he had put it. He would probably place it in his jacket pocket out of reflex, and forget it before the night was over. He had no way of knowing what that name was connected to. No way of knowing it had been appearing at the top of his son's lease invoices for 6 consecutive years. Harlow Property Group is the holding company I registered in 1991, under my late wife's maiden name. It owns 23 commercial properties across 4 states. Its flagship asset is a 14-story office building on Southwest Morrison Street in Portland, Oregon, built in 1997, currently leased to 22 commercial tenants. Among those tenants, occupying floors 11 through 14, under a 6-year lease agreement renewed 8 months ago, the agreement currently valued at approximately $3 million and bearing Vincent Ashford's signature on page 1, page 4, and the final exhibit, is a mid-sized technology consulting firm called Meridian Consulting. My son-in-law had just offered me $35,000 to disappear from his life. He had been paying me rent for 6 years. The card I left on top of his father's cashier's check was the key to a room they had been standing inside for 6 years, without knowing it existed. I drank my tea. Outside, the rain that had been threatening all evening finally arrived, tapping softly against the window over the sink. I thought about what Margaret had said. Men like you built the walls. I have been building walls since 1983. I have built walls in February, when the ground was frozen, and the foreman said it was impossible. I have built walls in neighborhoods nobody believed in yet, with second mortgages, and the specific stubbornness of a man who has decided that a foundation is a commitment. I have built 23 buildings across 4 states and held the paper on every one of them. The walls, as it happened, were not the point. The point was what the walls contained. It always had been. Let me tell you something about $35,000. It is not an insult in the way a slur is. Hot, immediate, designed to sting. It is an insult in the way a misdiagnosis is an insult. It tells you exactly how completely the other person has failed to understand what they are looking at. Gerald had looked at me across that table, at my gray jacket, my well-worn shoes, my weathered hands, my quiet, and he had done a calculation. He concluded, "This man has a price, and this is approximately it." Gerald had studied the wrong file. He had studied Edward Hargrove, retired, modest, a man who parks 4 blocks away and drinks medium drip from a cart on the corner. He had not studied Harlow Property Group. He had not studied the 41 years of deeds and leases and load-bearing calculations and the particular patience of a man who has never once needed to be the loudest person in the room because he has always been the person who owns the room. I finished my tea. I rinsed the cup. I turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. I slept well. I always do before a long project. A builder who cannot sleep the night before a complex job has not finished his preparation. I had been preparing for this one, without knowing it, for 6 years. I want to tell you what that business card actually is. Not what it looks like. I have already told you what it looks like. Plain white, minimal text, the kind of card that communicates nothing, which is precisely why I have used it for 30 years. When you hand someone a card that communicates nothing, they fill the silence with their own assumptions. Gerald's assumption, I was confident, would be building manager, facilities coordinator, the kind of man who handles other people's properties and calls himself a developer because it sounds better. He would pocket the card the way you pocket something you are too polite to set down in front of the person who gave it to you. What the card actually is, what Harlow Property Group actually is, requires a brief education in the architecture of holding companies. A holding company is not a secret. It is a structure. The purpose of a structure is to organize what is inside it in a way that serves the owner's interests, and one of the owner's interests is often privacy. When my late wife Margaret sat at our kitchen table in 1991 and wrote Harlow Property Group on a yellow legal pad, she was not trying to hide anything. She was applying a principle she had learned from watching me work for 8 years. The entity that signs the lease is not required to be the person who owns the entity. The building on Southwest Morrison Street is owned by Harlow Property Group. Harlow Property Group is owned by a family trust. The family trust was established under my name in 1991 and has been administered ever since by my property attorney, Ruth, who has been with me for 28 years and who is, in my professional opinion, one of the most capable legal minds in the Pacific Northwest, and possibly one of the most dangerous people in a room that does not know she is there. Ruth is 58 years old. She grew up in Bend, Oregon, the daughter of a timber contractor, and she understands the relationship between land and paper, the way only people who grew up watching that relationship determine their family's fortunes truly can. She put herself through the University of Oregon School of Law, working weekends at her father's contracting office, reading bid documents and subcontractor agreements while other people her age were doing other things. She has never raised her voice in a negotiation. She has never needed to. She communicates in documents, and her documents are exact. She is also the only person outside my immediate family who knows the full architecture of what I own. Because you cannot maintain 23 properties across 4 states without someone who knows where everything is, legally speaking. And that someone has been Ruth for 28 years. She has been the executor of Harlow Property Group's interests since the company was 6 months old. She knows every property in the portfolio, every lease, every tenant, every outstanding maintenance obligation, every clause that has ever been invoked or waived or quietly allowed to expire. She knows the Morrison Street building the way I know it, not with sentiment, but with attention. When I call her on the secure line we established for property matters in 1997, she answers on the second ring. She answered on the second ring. But I am getting ahead of myself. That call came 2 days after the dinner. Between the dinner and the call, there was a Saturday and a Sunday, 2 days during which I did what I always do when I have made a decision but have not yet begun executing it. I did nothing visible. I went to the farmer's market on Saturday morning. I walked the neighborhood in the afternoon. I read in the evening. On Sunday, I drove out to a property I own in Beaverton, a small industrial complex, 8 units, all occupied, and walked the perimeter the way I walk the perimeter of all my properties twice a year, checking the drainage, checking the foundation, looking for the small, early signs of the problems that become large, expensive problems if you wait until they are obvious. I found 2 minor drainage issues I made notes about. I called the property manager on Monday morning to schedule an inspection. I mention this not because it is interesting, but because it is instructive. People who mistake patience for passivity do not understand how either one works. I was not sitting still during those 2 days. I was running calculations. I was reading the clauses of a situation that had been presented to me across a restaurant table and working out, methodically and without drama, exactly what the structure of a response would look like. By the time I called Ruth on Monday morning, I already knew what I was going to ask her to do. I had simply been making certain that what I planned to ask was precisely what the situation required, not more, not less. Precision is the only form of power that does not announce itself. Before I tell you what Ruth found, and I want you to understand that what Ruth found was significantly larger than what I was looking for, which is itself a piece of information about the kind of man I had allowed my daughter to marry. I want to make sure you understand one thing about the Morrison Street building and its connection to Vincent. Vincent did not find the Morrison Street building through me. He has never known he was connected to me through that building. He never will, or rather, he did not until the Friday night that this story is building toward, at which point the connection became unmistakable and irreversible. But in the 6 years prior to that Friday night, the connection was invisible by design. This is how the design worked. In 2017, a commercial broker named Dan Feherty approached Harlow Property Group on behalf of a prospective tenant, a mid-sized technology consulting firm looking for Class A office space in Portland's central business district. The prospective tenant needed 4 floors of a building with adequate fiber infrastructure, a ground-floor conference facility, and visibility from a major arterial. The Morrison Street building met all 3 criteria. Dan Feherty dealt entirely with Harlow Property Group's property management division. He sent documents to a post office box. He received responses from Ruth's office. He negotiated lease terms with a leasing agent named Patricia, who has worked for Harlow for 14 years and who is authorized to execute term sheets on the company's behalf. The lease was signed in the conference room on the 11th floor of the Morrison Street building. Signed, I have been told, with considerable ceremony, by Vincent Ashford, CEO of Meridian Consulting, who shook Patricia's hand and thanked her, and apparently made a remark about how this building felt like a place where serious work could happen. He signed the lease into my hand. He had a pen he brought himself, a heavy matte black thing, the kind of pen that announces itself. He uncapped it with a small, deliberate motion. He signed his name on page 1, page 4, and the final exhibit, and he handed the pen back to Patricia with a nod. the nod of a man who has done something significant and wants it acknowledged. Patricia acknowledged it professionally, gathered the documents, and left. Then he renewed it, 8 months ago, for $3 million over 6 years, with what I am told was a case of celebratory champagne. He has been paying me rent, 12 quarterly installments of approximately $125,000 each, for 6 years. He has shaken my hand at family dinners. He has called me Edward. He has accepted a glass of wine from me at Christmas and talked to me about his company's growth, with the patient condescension of a man who believes he is speaking to someone who does not understand what a company is. He has paid me rent. He does not know. And this is what I want you to hold before I tell you what happened next. Before the call to Ruth. Before what Ruth found. Before the Friday night in the atrium, when the distance between what Vincent believed about the world and what the world actually was collapsed in the space of about 4 minutes. I want you to hold this. The business card I placed on top of Gerald's cashier's check was a contact card for Harlow Property Group, the name of the company that issues Vincent's lease invoices every quarter, the name of the company whose maintenance line his office manager calls when the HVAC needs servicing, the name that appears at the top of the $3 million document bearing his signature. Gerald had that card in his jacket pocket. He had been, without knowing it, in possession of the document that unlocked the room he had spent 6 years renting from me. He threw it away. I know, because Ruth had the restaurant's cleaning staff check the table after Gerald's party left. The card was in the linen, folded once, the way you fold something you are disposing of, rather than discarding without thought, which suggested he had at least looked at it. He had not put it in a pocket. He had not kept it. He had not searched the name. That is the last mistake Gerald made that I found funny. Now, before I tell you what Ruth found when she started pulling the thread on Meridian Consulting's financials, and I promise you that what she found is worse than what you are imagining, because what Vincent was doing was not small, and it was not careless, and it was not the desperate improvisation of a man in trouble. It was the systematic construction of a man who had decided the rules were for other people. I want to ask you something. If you have ever watched someone mistake your silence for surrender, if you have ever sat across a table from a person who believed they had finished you and did not know they had just handed you the key, leave a comment. Tell me where you are watching from. Hit the like button and subscribe, because we are not close to finished. A property developer's entire career is built on one principle. The man who holds the paper holds the power. For 41 years I held the paper and said nothing. I kept the asset in a holding company, registered under a name that was not mine. I sat on a bench once a month and drank coffee and watched a building that contained, among other things, my son-in-law's ambitions, my son-in-law's office, and my son-in-law's signature. Some people mistake silence for surrender. They always have. They are always wrong. I called Ruth on a Monday morning, 2 days after the dinner. I use a dedicated line for property matters, a number that has not changed since 1997, registered to the holding company, routed through an exchange that Ruth's office manages. I do not use it for personal calls. I do not give the number to people who are not involved in the business of Harlow Property Group. In 28 years, I have called it for lease negotiations, for acquisition due diligence, for property disputes, for 2 instances of tenant fraud, and for the kind of quiet structural problem that requires a lawyer rather than a contractor. I called it now for the same reason I have always called it, because something needed to be understood before it could be addressed. And Ruth is the person who does the understanding. She answered on the second ring. I told her what had happened at the dinner. I did not editorialize. I described the envelope, the cashier's check, the amount, the condition, Gerald's explanation, and Margaret's remark. I told her Vincent had not spoken during any of it. I told her I had left a Harlow Property Group card on the table, and walked out. Ruth listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a pause of approximately 3 seconds, the pause of a person who is already thinking, rather than still absorbing. She said, "What do you need?" I told her, "I need a full forensic review of Meridian Consulting's lease compliance on the Morrison Street building. Every clause, every payment, every modification, every interaction with our property management team, going back to the original execution date. I need their financial disclosures reviewed against public filings, and I need a complete background check on Vincent Ashford, personal finances, corporate accounts, investor relationships, beneficial ownership of any related entities." Ruth said, "That is a significant scope. Do you want me to prioritize any of it?" I said, "The lease compliance first, then the background, then the financials. If anything in the first 2 points toward the third, accelerate accordingly." She said, 72 hours. I said, "Take 48. There was a brief pause. Then she said, "Noted," and she was gone. I want to explain something about asking Ruth to do something in 48 hours that she estimated at 72. This is not how I normally operate. I am not a man who artificially compresses timelines to demonstrate urgency. In 41 years, I have found that artificial urgency produces artificial results. People who are rushing make errors, and in commercial real estate, errors in documents are expensive. But I had a specific reason for the compression in this case, and the reason was this. The dinner had happened on a Saturday. By Monday morning, Gerald and Margaret had been in possession of the Harlow Property Group card for approximately 36 hours. I did not know whether Gerald had looked up the name. I did not know whether he had made any calls. If he had been thorough, and everything about the dinner suggested a man who was thorough in his preparation, he might already be pulling threads. If he pulled the right thread before I was ready, the sequence would be disrupted. I needed to understand what I was working with, before anyone else understood what they were working against. Ruth called back in 44 hours. She did not begin with pleasantries. She never does. She said, "I need you to sit down." I said, "I am already sitting down." She said, "I know." I said it anyway. That is Ruth's way of telling you that what is coming is substantial. In 28 years, she has said it to me 4 times. The first time was in 2003, when a tenant on a property I owned in Tacoma turned out to be operating a financial services company that the SEC had been investigating for 11 months. I found out 2 weeks before the federal agents arrived, which was enough time to document the lease violations and begin eviction proceedings, which meant Harlow Property Group was a witness rather than a complication. The second time was in 2008, when the collapse of a regional lender threatened the financing structure on 3 of my acquisitions simultaneously, and I spent 4 months restructuring debt instruments I had assumed were settled. The third time was when Margaret received her diagnosis. Ruth called me because she had spoken to Margaret's attorney about the estate documents, and she wanted me to hear it from a voice I trusted before I heard it any other way. I have never forgotten that call. This was the 4th time she said it. I sat. I listened. She began with the lease compliance, as I had asked. 3 violations. The first, unreported sublet of approximately 40% of the 11th floor to a related party, a company called Cascade Workflow Solutions, registered in Oregon, whose sole registered agent was a name Ruth had already cross-referenced against Meridian's corporate documents. The name was a shell. The subletting had been occurring for 14 months. Under the terms of the Morrison Street lease, subletting to a related party, without written consent of the landlord, constitutes a material breach. The second violation, modification of the leased space without permit approval. Specifically, the removal of a load-bearing interior partition on the 12th floor and its replacement with a glass system that had not been submitted to the building department. I had noticed, during a site visit 18 months ago, that the sight lines on the 12th floor had changed. I had filed it under things to investigate and had not yet investigated. Ruth had now investigated. The third violation, late payment on the 3rd quarter installment, technically cured within the grace period, but documented in our payment records with a timestamp that placed it 4 days inside the cure window rather than the standard 2 to 3 days. Technically cured. On record. 3 violations, each one individually manageable. Together, under the specific language of Section 14.3 of the Morrison Street commercial lease, a clause I had insisted on in 2003 after the Tacoma situation, and had included as standard language in every lease I executed thereafter. They constituted grounds for termination of tenancy, with 30 days' notice, with forfeiture of the security deposit and any prepaid rent. I said, "Good. What else?" Ruth said, "The background check is where it gets significant." She told me to keep sitting. Meridian Consulting's financial disclosures, she said, are a fiction, not an exaggeration, not an optimistic projection, not the kind of aggressive revenue recognition that is technically defensible and professionally questionable. A fiction. For the past 14 months, Vincent had been operating a shadow billing structure, inflating client invoices by between 20 and 30%, and routing the overage through a series of consulting subcontracts issued to companies he controlled. The companies were shells. 2 were registered in Nevada, 1 in Delaware. Their registered agents were professional nominees, the kind of service you hire when you want a company to exist on paper without a human being visibly attached to it. The invoices these shells issued to Meridian were for services described in language generic enough to be unfalsifiable and specific enough to appear legitimate. Strategic advisory, technology integration consulting, market entry support. The shells invoiced Meridian. Meridian paid the shells. The shells routed the money through a single-layer pass-through and deposited it in a personal account held in Vincent's name at a private bank in the Cayman Islands. The account had been opened 22 months ago, 3 months before the shadow billing operation began. He had opened the account before he built the machine that would fill it. Ruth noted this detail specifically, and I want you to understand why it matters. A man who opens an offshore account and then constructs a billing fraud to fund it is not a man who made a bad decision under pressure. He is a man who decided, in advance and in private, that he was going to steal. He chose the destination before he planned the route. He had opened the account, confirmed the architecture, and then built the billing operation with the deliberate patience of someone who believes he will never be caught. The total amount diverted over 14 months was approximately $2.8 million. Ruth paused to let me absorb that number. I absorbed it. She continued. The $40 million acquisition, the deal Gerald had described at the dinner as the reason my modest lifestyle was a liability, the deal that required my removal from the picture, was built entirely on Meridian's fabricated financial disclosures. The acquiring company had been provided revenue figures that were inflated by approximately 40% over Meridian's actual performance. Their due diligence team had been given access to Meridian's internal financials, which had been prepared using the shadow billing revenues as legitimate income. The acquiring company was being asked to pay $40 million for a business whose actual revenue was roughly 60% of what had been represented to them. Vincent was not simply stealing from his clients. He was staging a fraudulent corporate acquisition. When the deal closed, if the deal closed, the acquiring company would own a consulting firm worth approximately $24 million and would have paid $40 million for it. The $16 million gap would be the spread between what Meridian actually was and what Vincent had told them it was. Vincent's personal proceeds from the Cayman account, combined with his equity stake in the acquisition, would make him extraordinarily wealthy. The clients he had overbilled would have no immediate recourse because the billing inflation had been structured as consulting markups rather than outright invoice fraud. The acquiring company's shareholders would bear the loss, and by the time anyone worked out exactly what had happened, Vincent would have had enough distance to make the forensic reconstruction difficult. It was, I said to Ruth when she finished, a well-constructed operation. She said, "It is. And it is also a federal crime in 4 separate categories." I said, "Who would handle it?" She said, "White-collar financial crimes, FBI field office. I have a contact there, a referral relationship I have maintained for exactly this kind of situation. Her name is Special Agent Diane Carver. I have worked with her twice before, on matters involving tenant fraud. She is thorough, and she is fast, and she will want to move quickly once she sees what we have." I said, "Not yet." Ruth was quiet for a moment. I said, "I need to see Claire first." Ruth said, "Understood." I said, "Compile everything, every document, every transaction record, every shell company registration, every payment timestamp. I want it organized so that someone with no prior context can sit down with it and understand the full picture in under 30 minutes. Ruth said, "I will have it ready by Friday." I said, "Good. Make sure every document has a chain of custody notation." I put the phone down. I sat at the kitchen table for a while. Outside the window, the backyard was gray and still. November in Portland. The kind of day that looks exactly the same at 9 in the morning as it does at 3 in the afternoon. I had been sitting at this table for 6 years, without knowing what was being built, 4 floors above my mechanical room in the Morrison Street building. I had been sitting across from Vincent at Christmas dinners and birthday lunches and the occasional Sunday afternoon when Claire wanted her family in the same room, and I had watched him describe his company's growth and his acquisition plans and his vision for what Meridian was becoming. He had described all of it to the man who owned the building he was doing it in. He had described the fraudulent acquisition to his landlord. I sat at the kitchen table, and I thought about Claire's coat, inside out in the restaurant, and the word she had used in her text, weird. She had not said alarming. She had not said wrong. She had said weird, because at the time, that was the largest word she had available for what she was sensing. I thought about the lights going down incrementally, the way a building settles. I thought about the fact that she had been living inside the orbit of a man running a $2.8 million shadow billing operation and staging a fraudulent $40 million acquisition, and the word she had found for what was wrong was weird. She had known something. She had always known something. She simply had not yet been given the full picture. I was about to give her part of it, not all of it, not yet. She did not need the full forensic audit before she needed her father. What she needed first was to know that the thing she had been sensing was real, and that it was being handled, and that she was not alone with it. I thought about what Ruth had found. I picked up the phone. Not the property line, my personal phone. I called my daughter. She did not answer. I left no message. I do not leave messages for Claire, not because I am averse to voicemail, but because Claire calls back within the hour when she sees my number, and a message would only give her something to worry about during the interval. I set the phone down and made dinner. I ate at the kitchen table. At 7:43, the phone rang. She said, "Dad, sorry, I was in the middle of something." I said, "It is fine. How are you?" There was a pause. Not long. 2 seconds, perhaps 3. But Claire and I have been having phone calls for 38 years, and I know what her pauses mean, the way I know what a building's sounds mean. A 2-second pause, before answering "How are you?" means the true answer is not the one she is about to give. She said, "I am fine, tired." I said, "Come for dinner Thursday. I will make the lamb stew." She said, "The one with the rosemary?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Okay, yes, I will be there." I said, "Good, drive carefully." I hung up. I did not say anything else. I did not ask about Vincent, or the dinner, or the envelope. I did not want to give her something to bring home and turn over in her mind in the days between Monday and Thursday. I wanted her to come through my door on Thursday evening the same way she had always come through my door, without having to perform anything, without having to decide in advance what she was going to say or how she was going to explain what was wrong. I had learned this from Margaret. Margaret always said, When someone is carrying something heavy, you do not ask them to describe it through a closed door. You open the door, and you let them put it down. Thursday evening came. Claire did not come. She appeared at my door on a Wednesday evening instead, 10 days after the dinner, not Thursday. She did not call first. She did not text. I was in the kitchen when I heard her car in the driveway. I know the sound of her car the way I know the sounds of my buildings. And then I heard the door, which she still opens with her key, the key I gave her when she left for college, and which I have never asked her to return. She was wearing a coat she had grabbed without thinking. It was inside out. The lining was showing, dark gray polyester, the stitching visible at the seams. She did not appear to know. Her eyes were red, in the particular way that means she had been crying recently, and had stopped, not in the way that means she was about to start. She came inside without speaking, and sat at the kitchen table. I had already put the kettle on. Not because I knew she was coming. I did not know she was coming. But I keep the kettle ready in the evening, the way I keep other things ready. Because the cost of readiness is low, and the cost of not being ready can be significant. A father learns this. I made the tea. I placed it in front of her. I sat across from her, and I waited. She said, "He restructured the accounts." I said, "Tell me." She told me. 3 days prior, so the Sunday after the dinner, Vincent had informed her that he had reorganized their joint financial accounts. For tax efficiency purposes, he said, the reorganization had removed her name from the primary operating account, the account from which their household expenses were paid, the account she had access to since the first year of their marriage. She had not been consulted. She had not been given advance notice. She had found out not from Vincent, but from her own bank, when she attempted to initiate a transfer, and received a message informing her that her account credentials were no longer recognized on the primary account. When she asked Vincent about it, he did not apologize. He did not explain fully. He told her she had been spending without strategic awareness in the period leading up to the acquisition, and that the account restructuring was a necessary protective measure for their financial position ahead of the deal closing. He said it the way he would say it to an employee, with the patient authority of a man delivering a policy update that does not require discussion. He said, "I should have told you sooner, but it would not have changed the outcome." She said, "He talked to me like I was a liability." I looked at her. I kept my voice level and my face open, the way I keep it in every situation where keeping it otherwise would serve no one. I said, "How long has this been happening?" She looked up at me. She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "The way he talks to you. How long has it been like that?" She was quiet for a long time. She looked at the tea in front of her, and she turned the mug a quarter turn with both hands, the way people handle things when they are thinking about something they have not yet decided how to say. Then she said, "A while." She said it quietly, not with anguish, not the way you say something you have been suppressing. The way you say something you have been carrying so long it has become part of the landscape, something you have stopped seeing clearly because you have been inside it. I thought about the lights going down incrementally. I said, "What happened with your accounts? Are you able to access money?" She said, "He gave me an allowance account, a separate account with a monthly transfer. He called it a household management account." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "Does anyone else know about this?" She shook her head. I said, "Has he asked you to sign anything recently?" She said, "There were some documents a few weeks ago." About the acquisition. He said they were standard, disclosure forms, something about spousal asset acknowledgement for the deal structure. He put them in front of her after dinner one evening and told her the attorney needed them back by morning. She signed them. She did not read them fully. She said, "I trusted him. I should not have trusted him." I said, "You trusted your husband. That is not something you were wrong to do. We will look at the documents." She said, "Dad, what is happening?" I reached across the table. I covered her hands with mine. My hands, as I have said, are weathered. 41 years of site visits, of cold mornings, of concrete and steel. They are not the hands of a man who has spent his life at a desk. She has always known the difference between my hands and other men's hands. When she was small, she used to trace the calluses and ask me what made them, and I would tell her, "That one is from a scaffolding rail in 1987. That one is from a poured concrete form I was helping to strip in 1993. That one I do not remember," which means it was nothing dramatic, just the ordinary accumulation of work done over time. She looked at my hands covering hers. I said, "I want to tell you something, and I need you to hear it clearly." She looked up. I said, "By the end of this week, Vincent will not be able to hurt you, or threaten you, or restructure anything in your name again." She started to say something. The acquisition, the investors, the 40 million, the deal that was too large to disturb, the consequences that would follow any disruption. I had anticipated this. I raised one hand slightly, and she stopped. I said, "A building is only as strong as its foundation. I know what his foundation is made of. I have had someone looking at it for 2 days, and I know exactly what is underneath it." She looked at me for a long moment. Claire is 38 years old, and she has known me her entire life. She has watched me sit on benches across from buildings. She has watched me read documents at dinner tables, and make phone calls at 6 in the morning, and conduct myself, in every professional situation she has ever witnessed, with the particular steadiness of a person who does not react to things until he has finished understanding them. She knows what steadiness looks like in me. She knows the difference between the steadiness of a man who does not know what to do and the steadiness of a man who has already decided. She said, "Okay. Just that. Okay." I said, "Go home tonight. Act as though nothing has changed. Do not sign anything he puts in front of you. Anything at all, regardless of how routine he says it is. Do not let him know you were here." She said, "How long?" I said, "Not long." She nodded. She picked up her tea and finished it. She sat for another few minutes, not talking, just sitting, the way she used to sit in this kitchen when she was a child and did not want to go to bed yet, when she just wanted to stay in the room where things felt settled. I did not rush her. A kitchen table, I have always believed, is the most load-bearing thing in a house. Not structurally. The other way. When she stood to leave, I stood with her. I walked her to the door. She turned to look at me in the doorway, her coat still inside out, the lining still showing. She had not noticed. I reached out and adjusted the collar slightly. Just the collar, just enough to straighten it, and then I kissed her forehead. She said, "The building. That is what you mean, isn't it? The Morrison Street building." I looked at her. She said, "You own it." I said, "Yes." She said, "How long?" I said, "I built it in 1997. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she took a breath, the long, slow breath of someone absorbing something that does not entirely surprise them, something that explains a great many other things that have been sitting unexplained for a long time. She put her hand on my arm briefly. Then she went to her car. I watched her taillights until they were gone. The street was quiet. November in Portland is always quiet in this particular way. The city pulls inward, the way a structure settles into its foundation in cold weather, the joints contracting, everything drawing closer to the center. I stood on the porch for a moment longer than I needed to. Then I went inside. I picked up the phone and called Ruth. I said, "It is time. Everything we discussed. Begin preparing the 3 actions. I want them ready to execute simultaneously on Friday evening." Ruth said, "The gala." I said, "Yes. I want Vincent to be standing in my building when he finds out I own it." Ruth said, "Understood. I will coordinate with the field office." I said, "Good." I put the phone down. The kitchen was quiet. The tea things were still on the table. 2 mugs, 2 spoons, the small ceramic pot that had been Margaret's. I cleared them and washed them, and set them to dry. The way I do every evening. The way I have done every evening since 1997, when the building on Southwest Morrison Street was still wet concrete and February rain. Some foundations take time to set. You do not rush the curing process. You do not test the load before the concrete has finished hardening. You wait until it is ready. Then you build. They are stronger for it. There are 3 actions. I want to describe them precisely, because precision is the only thing that separates a plan from a wish, and what I built in the days between Claire's visit and the Friday night gala was not a wish, it was a structure. Every structure requires load calculations. Every structure requires sequencing. You do not pour the roof before you pour the foundation. You do not pour the foundation before you have surveyed the ground. I had surveyed the ground. Ruth had done the rest. The 3 actions were designed to execute simultaneously, at a specific moment, on a specific evening, in a specific location. The location was the atrium of the Morrison Street building. The moment was the investor gala Vincent had organized to celebrate the pending acquisition, his peak, as I understood it, the evening he had designed as the public confirmation of everything he had been building. He had rented the atrium from Harlow Property Group for the occasion. He had rented his landlord's ballroom to celebrate a deal built on stolen money. The irony was not lost on me, though I did not dwell on it. I am not a man who dwells on irony. I use it. Action 1 was the lease violation notice. Under Section 14.3 of the Morrison Street commercial lease, the clause I had written into every lease I executed after the Tacoma situation in 2003, 3 documented breaches, taken together, constitute grounds for termination of tenancy. Ruth had the 3 violations documented, time-stamped, and cross-referenced against the lease language. The notice was 3 pages on Harlow Property Group letterhead, prepared with the specificity that Ruth brings to every document she touches. It cited the unreported sublet of the 11th floor, the unpermitted structural modification on the 12th, and the late Q3 payment. It triggered a mandatory cure period of 30 days, after which, if the violations remained uncured, Meridian Consulting's tenancy at the Morrison Street building would be terminated. 30 days. Vincent's acquisition was expected to close in 18. I want to be clear about something. The lease notice was not designed to destroy Meridian Consulting. A lease violation notice, in isolation, is a manageable document. Companies receive them. Companies cure them. Companies move on. I was not serving a lease violation notice to evict a tenant. I was serving it to make a visible, documented, public statement, at the precise moment of maximum visibility, that the building Vincent Ashford had been running his company from for 6 years was not what he thought it was. A company that receives a lease violation notice from its landlord the night of its acquisition gala is a company that has a problem it did not disclose in its due diligence materials. Sophisticated investors, and the people in that atrium were sophisticated investors, understand immediately what that means. It means the story they have been told has gaps. It means there are things they were not told. The notice was a signal. The forensic audit was the message. Together, they were a demolition. Action 2 was the disclosure of ownership. For 6 years, the Morrison Street building had operated under the Harlow Property Group name. My personal name, Edward Hargrove, appeared nowhere in the public registry. This was legal, standard, and entirely at my discretion to maintain or change. I chose, on the Friday evening of the gala, to change it. Ruth filed the amended ownership disclosure with the county property registry on the afternoon of the gala, reinstating my name as principal. The building would no longer operate under anonymous trust. If anyone, an investor, a journalist, a due diligence attorney, searched the Morrison Street building's ownership records after that Friday evening, they would find my name, the same name that appeared on the gala's registration list. The same name that was, as of that Friday evening, known to everyone in that atrium to be Vincent Ashford's father-in-law. The connection, once visible, would be impossible to unsee. Action 3 was Ruth's call to the FBI. She had briefed Special Agent Diane Carver on the forensic audit materials 2 days before the gala. Carver had reviewed the documentation, the shadow billing records, the shell company registrations, the Cayman account, the fabricated acquisition disclosures, and she had moved quickly, as Ruth had said she would. In federal white-collar cases, the window between evidence presentation and subject awareness is the most critical interval. If Vincent learned, through any channel, that his financial structure was under federal scrutiny before the gala, he would have options. He would call lawyers. He might move money. He might accelerate the acquisition close on a compressed timeline, or abort it entirely, in a way that protected the Cayman account from immediate seizure. Special Agent Carver understood this. She had 16 years of experience with cases exactly like this one, and her operating principle, Ruth told me, was straightforward. You move before they know you are moving. A white-collar financial crimes team was positioned to attend the gala. 4 agents, plain clothes, carrying credentials. Ruth had specifically requested one detail. The lead agent positioned at the service entrance would be a woman with experience in white-collar family networks. Someone who would recognize the supporting cast in a scheme like this one, and know what to look for in behavior that is not the principal's. Carver approved the request without hesitation. They would move when I gave the signal. The signal was the lease notice. When I placed the notice on the edge of the stage, that was the signal. I want to tell you about the week before the gala, because it is the part of this story that people rarely ask about and that I think about most often. The preliminary work, the calls, the documents, the legal architecture, that is comprehensible. People understand strategy. What they ask about less often is what it is like to move through an ordinary week, knowing that a Friday evening is coming, that will change the shape of several people's lives, including your daughter's, permanently. I moved through that week the way I move through every significant week, by doing the ordinary things with complete attention. I went to the farmer's market on Saturday morning and bought a bag of apples and a bunch of dried rosemary. I read in the evenings. On Tuesday, I had lunch with a property manager I have worked with for 12 years, and we talked about a drainage easement dispute on a property in Vancouver, Washington, that had been unresolved for 8 months, and that I had decided, during that lunch, to resolve through arbitration rather than continued negotiation. Decisions that have been sitting become easier to make when your mind is clear and you have other things in proper order. On Wednesday morning, I walked to the coffee cart on Morrison Street, and I sat on the bench across from the building. Kevin handed me my coffee without being asked. It was a gray morning, the kind Portland produces without effort in November, and the building was doing what it always does in gray light, absorbing it, going flat, becoming more itself. I sat and I drank my coffee, and I watched the 11th floor, and thought about the years of ordinary Tuesday mornings that had happened inside it, while I was sitting across the street, watching from outside. 6 years of mornings, 6 years of rent, 6 years of a man in that building who did not know who owned the walls around him. 6 years is a long time to hold paper without announcing it. 6 years is also, I have come to understand, exactly the right amount of time. You cannot rush the curing process. The concrete has to be ready before you test the load. On Thursday, I drove to the building and took the elevator to the 12th floor. I want to be honest about why I did this. It was not strategic. It was not a final inspection in the professional sense. I went because I built that building in 1997, and I have walked its corridors 100 times, and I wanted to walk them one more time before the Friday evening changed what walking them meant. After the gala, the building would be publicly mine in a way it had not been before. The anonymity would be gone. I wanted one last morning in it, when it was still only mine, in the way that things are yours, when no one else knows it. I took the elevator to the 12th floor. I walked the corridor slowly. The floors are polished concrete. I chose polished concrete over carpet in 1996, because carpet in a Pacific Northwest building collects moisture, and polished concrete does not. And 30 years later, that decision still looks exactly right. I ran my hand along the wall, the way I run my hand along the walls of all my buildings. It is not a sentimental gesture. It is the gesture of a man checking the temperature of a thing, the way you check whether a surface is dry or still wet, whether the structure is warm or cold, whether something is working or resting. I stopped in front of the glass door at the end of the corridor. The Meridian Consulting logo. Dark lettering on frosted glass. A clean, confident design, the kind of visual that is meant to communicate permanence and authority. Inside, a receptionist was at a desk near the entrance. A young woman with a headset, a monitor, and a cup of coffee she was not currently drinking. The office beyond her was lit and active. I could see the shapes of people at desks, the particular low-grade motion of a business going about a Thursday. None of them had any reason to notice a man in a gray jacket pausing outside their glass door. She glanced up when I stopped. I smiled at her in the way you smile at people in corridors. Briefly, pleasantly, without explanation, and continued past the door and down the corridor to the stairwell. I did not linger. I had seen what I came to see. I walked down 2 flights to the mechanical room on the 10th floor. I stood in there for several minutes, listening to the HVAC system, the same system that needed servicing 3 years ago, the same system whose repair budget I approved, the same system whose hum I have known since the building was commissioned. It is a particular sound. Every building has a sound that is specific to its mechanical systems, and once you know it, you recognize it, the way you recognize a voice. I stood, and I listened to it, and I thought about the fact that 4 floors above my head, Meridian Consulting had been going about its ordinary Thursday, while I stood in its basement and listened to the building breathe. I walked back up to the lobby. I nodded to the building's front desk attendant, a young man who has worked there for 2 years and who does not know who I am. He nodded back in the way lobby attendants nod at people who move through a building with the ease of someone who belongs in it. I pushed through the revolving door into the cold November air. I walked to my truck, 4 blocks away, the way I always do. The Morrison Street building was behind me. I did not turn around to look at it. I did not need to. I know it from every angle. I built it. I went home and ironed a suit. Charcoal, not bespoke, not theatrical, simply correct for the occasion, and hung it on the back of the bedroom door, where I would see it in the morning. I made dinner. I ate at the kitchen table. I went to bed at 10 o'clock. I slept well. Tomorrow was Friday. The gala began at 7. I arrived at 7:45. This was deliberate. When you own the room, you do not need to arrive first. You do not need to establish position or work the early crowd, or ensure that your presence is woven into the fabric of the evening before it gets underway. You arrive when the evening is already in motion, when the people inside it have already settled into the version of themselves they have decided to perform, when the architecture of the night is clear. You walk in and you read it. You find your position. You watch. I signed in at the registration desk in the lobby, the same lobby with the Portuguese limestone floors I chose in 1996, the same lobby whose northeast corner gets a draft in January that I approved a correction for in 2014. The coordinator at the desk was a young woman in event black, working from a tablet. She asked my name. I gave it. She found it on the list, printed a badge, and handed it to me, with a smile that did not register the name she had just read. I clipped the badge to the lapel of the charcoal suit. I walked through into the atrium. The atrium had been transformed. I want to say something about that word, transformed, because it is the word people use when they mean that the space has been covered over. White linen on every surface. Cocktail tables with low arrangements of something white and seasonal. An open bar along the east wall, staffed by 2 people in matching black. A temporary stage at the north end with a lectern and, behind it, a large LED wall displaying the Meridian Consulting logo in motion. A subtle animation, the letters assembling and reassembling in a loop, the kind of visual that costs money to produce and communicates that the person who commissioned it understands that spending money on appearance is itself a form of argument. String lighting above, a quartet in the southeast corner, playing something instrumental and ambient. 60 people, perhaps more, in the particular dress of people who have been invited somewhere because their money or their influence matters. It was a well-produced evening. I recognized the quality of the production the way I recognize the quality of a build, not with admiration exactly, but with the professional acknowledgement that someone had done the work correctly. The atrium itself, beneath all of it, was exactly as I had last seen it. I took a glass of water from a passing tray and found my position at the back of the room, beside the structural column at the northwest corner, the column I remember approving in the original architectural drawings in 1996, a load-bearing element that the architect had wanted to recess into the wall and that I had insisted remain exposed, because an exposed column in an atrium is honest about what it is doing, and I have always preferred buildings that are honest about what they are doing. The column is 2 feet in diameter and runs from the foundation slab to the ceiling of the atrium. 22 feet of reinforced concrete that has been holding up that corner of the building since 1997. I know its load calculations. I approved them. I stood beside it, the way I have always stood beside it, with my back to the wall and a clear sightline to the room. I stood there and I read the room. Gerald was near the bar, working it with the ease of a man who has attended many events funded by other people's money. He was in a dark suit, the reference-grade watch on his wrist catching the string lighting every time he gestured, which was often. He was talking to 2 men I did not recognize. The body language of the conversation suggested investors rather than colleagues, the particular forward lean of men who are being told something they find plausible and want to find more plausible. Gerald's hand moved in the small, controlled gestures of a man making a point he has made many times before and has confirmed that it lands. Margaret was nearby, in another version of silk, this one darker, charcoal, which I noted with the distant irony of a man who had ironed a charcoal suit the previous evening. She was talking to a woman I did not know, listening in the particular way that means she is waiting for a conversational opening rather than engaging with what is being said. She had a champagne glass in her right hand, and she held it at a consistent height, not drinking, just holding, the way you hold a prop. She had not seen me yet. I was at the back of the room, beside a column, and I am not a man who announces himself. Claire was near the side wall, to my left. She was wearing something dark blue. Her hair was down. She was standing with the particular stillness of a person who has decided to be present without being visible. Not hiding, exactly, but not leaning into the room either. Holding herself at the edge of it. She was holding a glass she was not drinking from, the same gesture as her mother-in-law's, though for entirely different reasons, I suspected. She had not come to perform. She had come because I asked her to, and because she needed to see it, and because I believed, correctly, as it turned out, that watching it happen would give her something that a description afterward could not. She was watching her husband with an expression that I recognized and will not name here, because naming it would reduce it, and it deserved more than that. Some things only have the right name in the moment they are felt. I looked at her for a moment longer than I should have. Then I looked at Vincent. Vincent was on the stage. He had not taken the lectern yet. He was still working the room from the elevated position of the stage's edge, moving along it with the practiced ease of a man who is comfortable being slightly above everyone else in the room. He was in a dark suit that fit precisely, a white shirt, a tie that hit exactly the right note between formal and confident. His hair was as it always is, controlled, deliberate, the hair of a man who has decided that every visible detail communicates something and has made his decisions accordingly. He was talking to 3 people in the front row. Investors, I assumed. People he wanted to anchor to the room before he spoke formally. And he was good. He was genuinely good at this. The eye contact was warm without being intense. The body language was inclusive. He laughed at something one of them said, in the way that makes the person who said it feel that they have been unusually perceptive. I watched him work the room, and I thought, he has built something real here. Not the financial disclosures, not the acquisition numbers. Those were fabrications. But the performance, the room, the confidence, the ease, those were real. He had constructed a version of himself that was genuinely compelling, and he had maintained it for long enough that it had become, in some functional sense, who he was. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, exactly the kind of thing that makes a man dangerous. The performance that has become so practiced, it no longer feels like performance to the person performing it. I stood at my column, and I let the evening build. At 8:15, Vincent moved to the lectern. The room settled into the particular quiet of an audience that has been waiting for the thing they came for. The quartet stopped playing. The bar paused. The conversations ended in the way conversations end when someone with authority in a room indicates that authority is about to be exercised. Vincent said, "Good evening." He said it the way a man says it when he means it, when he is genuinely glad to be standing where he is standing, in front of the people who are in front of him. The room responded with the warmth of people who have had 2 drinks and are inclined to be warm. He talked about Meridian. He talked about the arc of it, the early years, the growth, the contracts, the team. He was good at the arc. He had the ability to make a business history sound like a personal narrative, to make revenue milestones feel like character moments, to make the accumulation of commercial success sound like the inevitable result of a set of values, rather than the operation of market conditions and, in this case, systematic fraud. He moved through it with confidence and rhythm. He did not read from notes. He had internalized the story well enough that it came out as memory rather than recitation. He put up slides, numbers, charts showing revenue growth over 6 years, the fabricated numbers, the ones Ruth had spent 44 hours dismantling, presented here in clean graphical form on the LED wall behind him with the authority of things that have been designed to look like facts. I looked at the numbers on the screen. I looked at Vincent presenting them. He believed in them, I thought. Or he had believed in them for so long that the distinction between belief and performance had become academic. He talked about the acquisition, the $40 million deal. He described the acquiring company in terms that communicated their credibility without overselling it. A practiced calibration, the kind you develop when you understand that overselling creates skepticism and underselling creates distance, and the narrow corridor between them is where trust lives. He talked about what the acquisition would mean for Meridian, for the team, for Portland's technology sector. He talked about it the way a man talks about something he has earned. Gerald and Margaret were in the front row. Gerald was nodding, the slow, satisfied nod of a man watching a plan proceed. Margaret had her champagne glass raised. She was smiling. She had the expression of a woman who had spent her life in rooms full of successful men and was entirely comfortable being adjacent to one. I noted Claire, still at the side wall. She was still watching Vincent. The LED wall continued its loop, the Meridian logo assembling and reassembling, and Vincent was at the peak of it now, at the moment in a speech where the room is fully with you and you can feel it, when the energy of 60 people listening becomes something almost physical, a specific and particular kind of gravity that a confident speaker learns to recognize and to inhabit. He had the room. He had built to this moment for months, maybe years. He was standing in it. He did not thank Claire. He thanked his investors. He thanked his leadership team by name. He thanked Gerald and Margaret, who acknowledged it from the front row, with the slight inclination of people who have been publicly thanked before and know the appropriate response. He did not mention his wife. He did not mention his father-in-law. I was standing beside the column he had not thought to look for me at. For about 4 more minutes, he had the entire room. I set down my water glass on the cocktail table to my left. The glass made a small sound against the linen, just a tap, barely audible over the ambient noise of the room. Nobody near me noticed. Nobody near me was looking at a man in a plain charcoal suit setting down a water glass at the back of the room. I pushed off from the column. I walked toward the stage the way I walk toward every building I have ever owned, without hurry, without hesitation, with the complete and grounded certainty of a man who knows exactly whose floor he is crossing. The crowd parts for a man who moves with absolute certainty. Not because he is large, or loud, or because he has announced himself. It parts because certainty has a physical quality that people register before they consciously process it. A stillness in the movement, a directness in the line, the particular absence of hesitation that reads, at some level below language, as authority. I have walked through buildings my entire professional life with exactly this quality. I have walked through buildings under construction, through active negotiations, through rooms full of people who did not know who I was and who had no particular reason to move, and the crowd has always parted. Not out of deference, out of instinct. Because the body knows, even when the mind does not, when it is standing in front of something that has already decided. The atrium parted. I moved from the northwest column toward the stage at the north end of the room, crossing the full length of the atrium, and the people in my path shifted without being asked. A woman with a champagne glass stepped left. Two men in conversation paused and opened a gap. None of them knew why they were doing it. I was a man in a charcoal suit crossing a room. There was nothing remarkable about me. There was nothing remarkable about me that they could see. Vincent saw me when I was about 15 feet from the stage. I watched it happen. His rhythm broke. Just slightly. Just a fraction of a beat. The kind of interruption that only matters if you know the rhythm well enough to notice when it changes. His eyes registered me. Registered the direction of my movement, registered that I was not stopping, and in the space of perhaps 2 seconds, I watched his face do something it very rarely did. It went uncertain. The confidence, the performed, practiced, entirely real confidence, flickered. He continued speaking. He did not stop. He finished his sentence. But the sentence after that was slightly shorter than it would have been. And the one after that shorter still, the way a building's rhythm changes in the seconds before something structural gives way. Gerald turned from the front row. I saw the moment he recognized me. His face did not do what Vincent's did. Gerald is not a man whose face shows uncertainty easily, but something changed in his posture. A micro-adjustment. The slight repositioning of a man who has spotted a variable he did not account for and is recalculating. Margaret's champagne glass stopped halfway to her mouth. She did not lower it. She held it there, suspended, the way you hold something when your body has received information that your mind has not yet finished processing. I reached the edge of the stage. I did not climb it. I did not need to. The stage was perhaps 18 inches above the atrium floor, and the lectern was near the back of it, and Vincent was at the lectern, and the distance between us was perhaps 10 feet, close enough that the room could see both of us clearly, far enough that I was not crowding him, far enough that when I spoke, the people in the front rows could look at him and look at me without turning their heads more than a few degrees. I said, "I apologize for the interruption." I said it at a volume that carried to the back of the room, without appearing to, a skill I learned in 41 years of walking construction sites, of calling across floors to foremen, of addressing groups of subcontractors in spaces where the acoustics are determined by concrete and steel rather than by design. A room trained by good acoustics teaches you to project. A room that has not been trained teaches you something better: how to fill it without filling it, how to be heard without appearing to raise your voice. The room went silent. Not the gradual quiet of an audience settling, the immediate, complete silence of 60 people who have registered that something is happening that was not on the program. I held up the document in my right hand. 3 pages, folded once, Ruth's letterhead visible at the top. I said, "My name is Edward Hargrove." I am the principal owner of this building. I am also, as some of you may know, the father of Claire Hargrove Ashford, who is standing near the side wall and who is, as of this evening, no longer married to a man who has access to her financial accounts. I placed the lease violation notice on the edge of the stage. I set it down flat, facing Vincent, the way you place a document you want properly read. I said, Meridian Consulting is currently in breach of 3 clauses of its commercial lease with Harlow Property Group. This document is formal notice of those violations. The cure period is 30 days. Vincent had not moved. He was standing at the lectern with both hands on its edges, and he was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Not the performed confidence, not the calibrated warmth, not the patient condescension he had deployed at every family dinner for 6 years. Something underneath all of that. Something that did not have a performance ready because it had never needed one before. From the right side of the room, Ruth stepped forward. She had been there the whole evening. I knew where she was. I had placed her, earlier in the day, at a table near the East Bar, with a name badge that identified her as a guest of the event's coordinator, which was technically true because I had arranged the coordinator. She stepped forward now with the precise, unhurried movement of a woman who has been waiting for a specific moment and has arrived at it. She carried a second document, a bound folder, perhaps 40 pages, organized with tabs. She walked to the stage and held it up to Vincent. She said, Mr. Ashford, this is a forensic audit summary of Meridian Consulting's financial operations for the past 14 months. It documents a shadow billing structure that has diverted approximately $2.8 million from client accounts through 3 shell companies to a personal account held in your name in the Cayman Islands. It also documents the material misrepresentation of Meridian's revenue in the financial disclosures provided to your acquisition counterparty. The room was completely, entirely, absolutely silent. Not the silence of an audience that has been surprised by something and is processing it. The silence of 60 people who have understood something, each of them arriving at the understanding at slightly different rates, depending on how much they knew going in and how quickly they could recalibrate. I have been in rooms when bad news arrives. I have been in rooms when fraud is disclosed, when deals collapse, when the number on a document turns out to be wrong in a way that cannot be corrected. I know what that silence sounds like. It sounds like this. At the back of the room, a man in a gray suit was already on his phone. At the bar, one of the women who had been talking to Gerald 20 minutes ago turned to her companion and said something very quietly that I could not hear from where I was standing. 2 people near the side exit were moving toward it, with the careful casualness of people trying to leave without appearing to flee. The LED wall behind Vincent continued its loop. The Meridian logo assembled, reassembled, assembled again. $40,000 worth of branding, still performing the story that the rest of the room had just stopped believing. I looked at Vincent. His hands had not moved from the lectern edges. His knuckles, I noted, had gone pale. I looked at Gerald in the front row. Gerald was sitting very still, the stillness of a man who has understood something and has not yet decided what to do with the understanding. I looked at Margaret. She still had her champagne glass raised. She had not moved it. The champagne inside it was completely still, not a ripple, the glass held with the frozen precision of a woman whose body has stopped taking instructions from her mind. I looked at her. I said, "Your mother told me, at a restaurant table 3 weeks ago, that men like me build the walls." I paused. The pause of a man who has been waiting for this sentence for 3 weeks and is not going to rush it now that it has arrived. I said, "She was right." Another pause, shorter. I said, "Men like me build the walls, and men like me decide when they come down." In the back of the room, the service door opened. 3 men in dark suits entered, not from the main entrance, not from the bar side, but from the service corridor that runs along the east wall of the building. The corridor I approved the dimensions of in 1996. The corridor whose door I have a key to, because I have always had a key to every door in every building I have ever built. They walked from the service door toward the stage with the unhurried confidence of people who are not in a hurry because there is nowhere for anyone to go. They wore dark suits, and they carried credentials, and they moved the way people move when they have done this before and know exactly what they are doing. Special Agent Carver's team, exactly where Ruth had coordinated them. I stepped back from the stage. I had said what I came to say. I had placed what I came to place. The room was no longer Vincent's, and it would not be his again. Not this room, not in the configuration he had spent months assembling. The foundation he had built his peak moment on had been exposed for what it was, in front of the 60 people whose opinion of it mattered most, in the building that had always been mine. Vincent had not moved from the lectern. He was still standing with his hands on its edges, and he was looking at the forensic audit folder that Ruth had placed on the stage in front of him, not opening it, not speaking, just looking at it, the way you look at a document you have been handed and do not want to touch. His face had undergone a change I had not seen in 6 years of watching it across dinner tables and holiday gatherings. The performance was gone, not stripped away, not exposed in a dramatic way, not replaced by something rawer or more honest, simply absent. The way a building looks when the facade comes down during a renovation, not destroyed, just revealed as incomplete, as the front of something rather than the thing itself. His hands were shaking, not dramatically, a slight tremor at the fingertips, the kind that happens when the body has received a signal that the mind is still trying to refuse. From the front of the room I heard a sound, a chair, pushed back, Gerald, standing, moving toward the exit near the stage. The fourth agent was already at that door. She was a woman, as Ruth had requested. She had 16 years of experience with white-collar family networks, and she knew exactly what to look for in the behavior of the people who surround a principal. She positioned herself at the door with the quiet ease of someone who has had this conversation before and knows how it ends. Gerald stopped. He looked at her. She said something I could not hear from where I was standing, said it pleasantly, said it with the particular professional warmth of someone who does not need to raise her voice because the situation does not require it. Gerald sat back down. He sat the way a large man sits when the room has changed around him and the changed room does not have a place for large gestures anymore. He put his hands flat on his knees. He looked at the table. He did not look at Vincent. He did not look at me. He had the expression of a man who has run a very long calculation, very quickly, and arrived at an answer he did not want. Margaret put her champagne glass on the table. The champagne spilled, just a small amount, over the rim onto the white linen, and she did not notice. Or she noticed and did not respond. Either way, she did not move to correct it. She sat with her hands in her lap, and she looked at the table in front of her, and she did not look at me. The woman who had said 3 weeks ago across a restaurant table that men like me build the walls, she sat in my building on my marble floors, on my white linen, with spilled champagne in front of her, and she looked at the table. I did not look at her either. I had finished with her. I was already looking for Claire. She was still at the side wall. The room was clearing around her, not in a rush, but with the steady, purposeful movement of 60 people who had arrived for one kind of evening and were now in a different one and needed to make phone calls that could not happen in this room. The agents were positioned at the stage. 2 were speaking with Vincent quietly and methodically. A third was at the north exit. Gerald was still seated, phone in hand, not using it. A man who has run his list of available calls and found them all insufficient. The quartet had stopped playing. The bar had closed. Claire was at the side wall. She was still holding her glass. She had not moved during any of it, not when I crossed the room, not when I spoke, not when the agents came through the service door. She had stood where she was, and she had watched, and the expression on her face had changed during it, in ways I observed from across the room, and will not try to describe in full, because I only had pieces of it, and the full picture belonged to her. I walked to her. She watched me come. She did not move toward me, or away from me. She stood where she was, the way she had stood as a child, when she had done something she was not certain about, and was waiting to understand what it meant. Still, present, undefended. I stopped in front of her. For a moment neither of us said anything. Around us, the room continued its quiet dispersal. Somewhere near the stage, one of the agents said something to Vincent in a low voice. A woman in the far corner was on her phone, speaking rapidly and quietly, one hand pressed over her other ear to block the ambient sound of the room. Claire looked at me. She said, "The floor we are standing on." I said, "Yes." She looked down at the Portuguese limestone beneath her feet. The same limestone I had chosen in 1996. The same stone that had been here when she was 32, and Vincent signed the first lease, and I said nothing. When she was 34, and the lease was renewed. When she was 38, and the lease was renewed again, for $3 million on a Friday afternoon, with champagne in a conference room 2 floors above our heads. She said, "Is this yours too?" I said, "It is yours. It has always been yours. Everything I built is yours. That is the only reason I built it." She looked up from the floor. She looked at me. She was not crying. She had cried already, I thought, in the weeks before this evening, in the private hours of a marriage that was ending, before it had formally ended. And what was left on the other side of that crying was not grief exactly, but something more complicated, something that needed its own name and had not found one yet. She said, "When did you know?" "About the money, about what he was doing." I said, "I did not know about the money until Ruth found it, 11 days ago." She said, "But you suspected." I said, "I suspected the man. I did not know the specifics until Ruth found them." She was quiet for a moment. She looked across the room at Vincent, who was now seated at the edge of the stage, with one of the agents beside him, and a second document in his lap. Not the forensic audit. Something else. Something the agent had produced. His head was down. He was not looking at anything in particular. He had the posture of a man who has been running a very long race and has just been told, at mile 23, that the finish line has moved. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at me. She said, 6 years. I said, "Yes." She said, "You have been sitting on that bench for 6 years, watching the building, watching him go in and out." I said, "I was watching the building. He happened to be inside it." She almost smiled at that. Not quite. But almost. The small movement at the corner of her mouth that means she has recognized something true and is deciding whether to let it land as funny or as something else. She said, "The business card. At the restaurant. You left the Harlow card on the envelope." I said, "Yes." She said, "You knew what it was. When you put it down, you already knew what you were going to do." I looked at her. I said, "I knew what the card was connected to. I did not know yet what I was going to do with the connection. That took a few more days." She nodded slowly. She was processing something. Not the events of the evening, I thought, but something larger. Something that had been accumulating for longer than the past few weeks. The way a structure accumulates load over time. Not in one dramatic event, but in the steady, daily addition of weight that eventually becomes impossible to ignore. She said, "I knew something was wrong. I have known for a long time. I just did not have a name for it." I said, "I know." She said, "I kept thinking I was misreading it, that I was not seeing it correctly." "He is very good at making you feel like you are not seeing it correctly." I said, "He is. That is a real skill. It does not make it your failure." She looked at her glass. She had been holding it all evening, and it was still mostly full. White wine, warm now, long past the point of being enjoyable. She looked at it for a moment, and then set it carefully on the cocktail table nearest to her, with the deliberate precision of someone putting something down that they have been holding for too long. I watched her do that. She reached out then and took my hand. Not the way a child holds a parent's hand. Not from below, not looking for steadiness in the way you look for it when you are small and uncertain. The way two people hold hands when they have both been through something and are standing on the other side of it together. Her hand was cool. She had been holding the cold glass, and she held mine the way my hands have always been held, around the calluses, around the weathered knuckles, without flinching from the texture of them. I held her hand. Around us the room continued to empty. The LED wall at the north end had been switched off. The Meridian logo had stopped its loop. The atrium without it was darker and quieter, and more itself. Just the Portuguese limestone, and the exposed columns, and the ceiling I had approved in 1996. Just the building. I said, "The building is still standing." She said, "Yes." I said, "It will still be standing tomorrow." She looked at me. She understood what I meant, not as metaphor, but as fact. The building would be here tomorrow. It had been here for 27 years, and it would continue to be here. Whatever the next weeks and months required of her, the building would be standing. And it was hers. Everything I had built was hers. That was the only reason I had built it. A property developer knows that sometimes the most important thing a foundation does is simply hold. It does not announce itself. It does not demand recognition for the weight it has been carrying. It holds because that is what it was built for. I held my daughter's hand in the atrium of a building I built in 1997. The room was quiet now. The agents were doing their work. Gerald was still at his table. Margaret was still looking at the tablecloth. Claire did not hug me immediately. She stood for a long time, looking at the floor, at the limestone, at the stone that had been here through 6 years of her marriage, and would be here through what came next. Then she took a breath. She squared her shoulders the small way she has squared them since she was 7 years old. Not dramatically, just a slight lift and set, the gesture of a person who has decided to carry the weight rather than put it down. She looked up at me. She said, "Breakfast. Tomorrow. Can we have breakfast?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Your kitchen." I said, "I will put the kettle on." She nodded. She let go of my hand. She picked up her coat from where she had set it on a chair near the wall, still inside out, the lining still showing, the seams still visible. And she put it on without looking at it, the same way she had arrived, and she walked toward the lobby door. I watched her go. Then I stood for a moment in the quiet of the atrium, in my building, on my floor, between my columns, and I looked at the room the way I look at all my buildings when the day's work is done, with the satisfaction of a man who has checked the load calculations and found them correct, who has done what he set out to do and can now simply stand in it. I buttoned my jacket. I walked to the lobby, through the revolving door, and 4 blocks to my truck. It is the first Monday of the month. I am sitting on the bench across from the Morrison Street building, with a medium drip from Kevin's cart. The morning is doing what Portland mornings do in December, holding its gray steady, simply existing in the particular suspended patience of a northwest winter day. I have sat on this bench in every season for 19 years, in grief, in satisfaction, in the ordinary unmarked hours between. This morning is different from all of those. This morning, Claire is coming for breakfast. She called at 8 o'clock, from her own number, her own phone, her own account, reinstated last week with the help of an attorney Ruth recommended. The financial untangling completed in 9 days. Claire called to ask if I still wanted to have breakfast. I said yes. She said she would be there at 9:30. I said I would put the kettle on. She said, "You already have it on, don't you?" I said, "It is ready when you get here." I am on the bench now, waiting, looking at the building. Let me tell you what has happened since the Friday evening in the atrium. Vincent is awaiting trial. The federal charges cover wire fraud, money laundering, and securities fraud. His attorneys have filed the expected motions. I do not follow it closely. Ruth follows it for me and tells me what I need to know, which is not much. I built the structure that made the exposure possible. What follows belongs to a different set of institutions. The acquisition fell apart within 48 hours. The acquiring company's legal team withdrew before the weekend was over. Meridian Consulting is in receivership. The Morrison Street lease has been formally terminated. The 4 floors are vacant. I have had 3 broker inquiries about the space in the past 2 weeks. Gerald and Margaret returned to San Francisco 3 days after the gala. They have not been back. I do not think about them often. The business card is in my shirt pocket. Ruth had it retrieved from the restaurant table that night, before the table was cleared. I have been carrying it since. The Harlow Property Group card. Plain white, minimal text. The card I placed on top of Gerald's cashier's check at a Pearl District restaurant table on a Thursday evening that feels both very recent and very long ago. I will not throw it away. Some things earn the right to be kept. It is the key to a room that 3 people stood inside for 6 years without knowing it existed. I look at the building. Buildings are more patient than people. They outlast the people who rent them, and the people who try to use them, and the people who stand inside them and believe, because the walls are around them, that they understand the walls. A building does not need you to understand it. It needs you to have built it correctly. If you have built it correctly, it will do its work without requiring your attention or your acknowledgement. I come on the first Monday of every month anyway. Not because the building needs me here. Because I need to be here. Because 19 years of sitting on this bench has become the way I mark the passage of time, the way I take inventory of what is standing. This bench is part of my accounting. This morning is a line in the ledger. A man once told me, through a woman who delivered his opinion with the serene certainty of someone who has never been wrong about the distance between people, that men like me build the walls. He meant it as a limitation. He meant it as the ceiling above which I could not rise, the category into which I had been permanently sorted, the thing I was, and therefore not the thing that mattered. He was trying to insult me. He did not know that walls are the only things that matter. I hear a car behind me. I recognize it without turning around. The particular sound of Claire's engine, the specific idle of it, the way it settles when she cuts the ignition. I have known that sound since she was 26 and bought the car with her first real paycheck and called me to say she had done it. I have heard it in driveways and parking lots and on this street. I know it. I do not turn around yet. I take one more sip of my coffee. I look at the building, at the 14 stories, at the Portuguese limestone lobby visible through the ground floor glass, at the 11th floor, where the Meridian Consulting logo no longer appears on the frosted glass door, at the structural columns, and the February foundation, and the 27 years of standing. Then I hear her footsteps on the pavement behind me. I turn around. She is wearing her coat correctly this time. Her hair is up. She is carrying 2 cups from a coffee shop around the corner. She has stopped somewhere on the way, gotten coffee, thought to bring a second one. She is looking at the building. She says, "I always wondered why you sat here." I say, "Now you know." She hands me the second coffee. I take it. She sits down beside me on the bench, and we both look at the building. At the thing I built in February of 1997, in the wrong weather, on a bet I was right to make. At the foundation that has been holding for 27 years. At the walls. We sit for a while. Then I say, "Are you ready for breakfast?" She says, "Yes." We stand. I put the business card back in my shirt pocket. I finish my coffee. We walk to our cars. The building stands behind us. It will be standing when we come back. It will be standing long after that. That is what buildings do, when you build them right.